Hey guys, I'm back with the second video of the video series on our environment class 10th science, and in this video we are going to talk about food chain, steps in a food chain and the trophic levels. Now trust me, this is a very important topic, so stay focused. So are we all ready? Let's get started. So let us look at the various levels of consumers. So here we are going to see who eats whom. So like till now we have spoken about the producers who produce things and the consumers. And in consumers also we have so many different consumers. We have herbivores, we have carnivores, we have omnivores. So let us look at the level of each of these consumers. So we will start with the producer, right? That is the one who produces food. So in the producer, we have the green plants who perform photosynthesis and provides us with food. Then comes the primary consumers. Who are the primary consumers? Those who directly feed on these green plants, that is the herbivores. So organisms which feed on producers. So the herbivores are the primary consumers. Right? So here the terms primary consumer, instead of herbivore, many people will refer it as primary consumer. That means the consumer who primarily depend on plants. So in this we can consider the example of a grasshopper, because a grasshopper feed on plants. The next is a secondary consumer. That means the consumer or the organism which feed on the primary consumer. So organisms which feed on primary consumer, so these are carnivores, because carnivores will feed on the herbivores. So here we can take the example of frog. So the frog feeds on this grasshopper. So the frog becomes a secondary consumer. Then comes the tertiary consumer. So you see the level is increasing. So tertiary consumer, those which feed on the secondary consumer, right? So these are also carnivores, because what are carnivores? Carnivores is a very general word. It means any organism which feed on other organism. So whether the frog who is eating a grasshopper or whether it is a snake who is eating the frog. So both of them are carnivores, because both of them are eating other animals. So be it the frog eating the grasshopper or the snake eating the frog, just that the level of consumer is more. So a frog is, both are carnivores, but a frog is a secondary consumer, whereas a snake is a tertiary consumer. Then we can even have quaternary consumer. That means something who is feeding upon the tertiary consumer. For example, so that organism is also going to be a carnivore. For example, here this bird called hawk, you would have heard about it, right? It's a very big bird and it generally feeds on other animals. So if you see all these three, frog, snake as well as the hawk, they are all carnivores. But since they feed on different animals, so their levels are different. Because if the hawk would have been feeding on an animal who is directly dependent on plants. So that is, if the hawk would have been eating an animal who is a herbivore, in that case the hawk would have been the secondary consumer. But that is not the case. Now as the level increases, so the level also increases here. So with the increasing level, it comes with primary consumer, then secondary, then tertiary, and then quaternary consumer. Now what happens to this hawk? Who will eat this hawk? Now once this hawk dies, who will decompose it? The decomposers, right? So the entire story starts with the producers who produces food. Then comes a wide variety of consumers who will actually consume this food either directly from the producers or indirectly from the producers. And then comes the decomposers who will decompose the dead bodies of all the producers and the consumers. And these producers, consumers and decomposers will together form the biotic component of an ecosystem. Now you might ask that we have spoken about the entire level. We saw the herbivores there as primary consumers. We saw the carnivores there as secondary, tertiary and quaternary consumer. What about the omnivores? Where are the omnivores? Now see, omnivores are those who feed on both plants as well as animals. So now if we talk about an omnivore who is feeding only on plants, for example, as I told, there are certain human beings who are vegetarian. They feed only on plants. They do not, they do not eat animals. So if we are talking about those kind of omnivores who feed only on plants, then we can say that they are primary consumers. But if we are talking about omnivores who are feeding on an animal who is directly depending on plants, for example, if we talk about a human being who feeds on grasshopper, so we say that that omnivore falls under the category of secondary consumer. Again, if a scenario comes where we say that a human being is feeding on a frog, so that means he is a tertiary consumer. So depending upon what an omnivore is eating, we will decide whether it is a primary consumer, secondary consumer, or a tertiary consumer, right? So they can be primary consumers if they are feeding only on plants. They can be secondary or tertiary consumers depending on which level consumers are they feeding upon, right? Okay, so I hope this concept is clear about the consumers. So broadly, three types under the biotic components: producers, consumers, and decomposers. Under consumers, we have different types of consumers. They are herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, and parasites. So they are the types of consumers. And what are these? Primary consumers, secondary consumer, tertiary consumers. These are the different levels of consumers depending upon on which organism they feed upon. Right? So I hope I have been able to explain you the concept of the levels in a consumer, because this is really going to help you when we talk about or when we try to learn food chain. So this is going to be really helpful. We will now talk about another important concept called food chain. So far we saw the different levels of consumers, and we also saw that how living organisms depend on one another for their food. So now this dependency of living organisms on one another is defined or is described in a food chain. So what is a food chain? The word chain means many small objects connected together forming a long rope-like structure. That is a chain. So series of living organisms feeding on one another is known as a food chain. So let us look at an example so that the concept becomes clearer. For example, plants, deer, tiger. So if you see, plants are the producers here, right? Because they are producing food. Now these animals, deer, they feed on plants. And these deer are then fed upon by animals like a tiger. So this is forming a food chain. That means plants which are eaten by a deer. Deer in turn is eaten by a tiger. So this is a series of living organisms feeding on one another. So this is called as a food chain, right? Now it is not only 2 or 3 animals involved in a food chain. There can be many animals involved in a food chain. For example, let us look at the steps in a food chain. That means a food chain can have 2 steps, it can have 3 steps, it can have 4 steps. So what do we mean by steps in a food chain? Let us look at the smallest and simplest food chain, a food chain with 2 steps. That means the first step is the plants, the next one is elephants feeding on plants. So that is the food chain. So nobody else is feeding on any elephants. So it is a small 2 steps food chain because it involves 2 living organisms. Similarly, we can have a food chain with 3 steps. The one which we considered in the last slide, maybe deer feeding on plants, and these deer in turn is fed upon by the tiger. Similarly, we can have a 4-stepped food chain. For example, goat, they feed on grasses. Then you have jackals who feed on the goats. And these jackals in turn are eaten by the lions. So this is a food chain involving 4 steps. Similarly, you can have a food chain with 5 steps as well. For example, you have the grasses which are eaten by the grasshoppers. The frogs feed on the grasshoppers. Snakes feed on the frogs. And the hawk feeds on the snakes. So you see the number of steps keep increasing, right? So when I talk of food chain, it is not necessary that it has to involve only 1 or 2 organisms. It can involve many organisms as well. But generally it is seen that a food chain consists of 3 to 4 levels, not more than that. Now why so? That we will talk as we go ahead with this topic. So let us look at the trophic levels in a food chain. What do we mean by trophic levels? So each level of a food chain is termed as trophic level. So just now I was talking about the steps, right? So those steps are nothing but each level of a food chain, and each such level is known as a trophic level. So this is a term which is given to the level of a food chain. So if I talk about, let us look at the same example. Let us look at the 5-stepped food chain, where grass is eaten by grasshopper, which in turn is eaten by frog, which in turn is eaten by snakes, and then by the hawks. So let us look at this example. So which is the first level of these food chain? The plants, that is the producers, right? So these plants prepare food by the process of photosynthesis in presence of sunlight. So they form the first trophic level. So the first trophic level are always the producers. Which is the next level? The next trophic level are the grasshoppers. So these are the next trophic level. So plants are the first trophic level. Then comes the third trophic level. Who are the third trophic level? The frogs. So basically we can say that second trophic level was nothing but the herbivores, right? In the third trophic level we have the carnivores. Maybe we can call them as the small carnivores, or we can call them as the secondary consumers, right? So you have different names now. So these are the maybe small carnivores. Then comes the fourth trophic level, which is nothing but the snakes. So we can say they are little larger carnivores. And then comes the hawk, which is the fifth trophic level, right? So as the level keeps increasing in a food chain, we call them as first trophic level, second trophic level, third trophic level, and so on, right? So now you understand what is a food chain. What do we mean by trophic levels in a food chain? A food chain can have 2 levels, it can have 3 levels, it can have 4 levels and 5 levels as well. So let us look at some examples of food chains in various ecosystems. So before starting with this, as we started with this lesson, we have spoken about the ecosystems, right? So let us see how food chains exists in different ecosystems. Let us look at the ecosystem forest, right? So here we can consider a food chain like this, where plants in the forests are eaten by goats, which in turn are eaten by the jackals, and the jackals in turn are eaten up by the lions. So this is an example of a food chain existing in forest. Similarly, can you think of a food chain existing in a pond, where you have water, where you have fishes, you have insects, you have aquatic plants? So here you can say that the small plants which exist inside the water, when you go, from the surface you cannot see, but when you go inside the water you can see that there are small plants which exist inside the pond. So these plants are eaten by small insects present inside the water, which in turn are eaten by small fishes, and the small fishes in turn are eaten by the bigger fish. So this is a food chain existing in a pond. Similarly, garden. So in your garden you would have seen that the plants, maybe the rose plant, so that is being fed by the small green flies in the garden, which are very commonly seen. Now these small green flies in turn are eaten by these ladybirds. They in turn are eaten by these small birds, and these birds are eaten up by a bigger bird like a hawk, right? So this is food chain which exists in your garden, right? So these are some of the examples of food chains in different ecosystems. Similarly, you can think of food chains in many other ecosystems, for example in an ocean, or in a river, or maybe in a zoo or aquarium. So everywhere you can think of such food chains, because these kind of food chains exist in every ecosystem.
I hope you found this video useful. If you have a feedback or you want to share your experience with us, do let us know in the comment section, and I will see you all very soon with a new video, with a new topic. Till then, take care. Bye-bye.